CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode on Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Bhekinkosi Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the West Business School in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm really excited today to be joined by Ashley Green Thompson. Ashley is the founding director of Ubumbano. However, we're going to cover much of the ground and some of the experiences that he has gone through. But Ashley, welcome to this conversation. Let me start with something that you and I do a lot. How is your running and jogging going?
It's going very well. It's going very well. I'm deep into training now for my 10th Comrades Marathon. So I was worried I wouldn't get because when you get 10, you get the green number.
Yeah.
And COVID did a number on me during, so I was in hospital for a while. But I'm happy to say that I'm getting. I won't run as fast as you, but I think you're a bit younger than me, so that's okay. Right?
I saw you in Naivasha and I was like, this man is really preparing for his upcoming marathon. But let's talk a bit about that. Why do you find it useful to invest so much time in running? It's not just for physical health. I know there are other motivations for most runners. In your case, what is it that keeps you going year after year?
You know, I used to smoke 20 cigarettes a day. And then when I stopped, my taste buds came back and I got very big. Because I ate everything. You know, I could have a glass of whiskey and a cake, chocolate cake at the same time. So I started running, and but it's become a part of my life. You know, there's a saying, I don't run to get fit. I get fit so I can run. You've got that time, it's just you and the road, your body, your mind. So it allows me time to reflect and think about things. It's really one of the greatest parts of my life. I thoroughly enjoy running. A lot of people don't think that's actually true because they think, why would you run when you can drive? No, I think it's become an important part of my life.
I've also found that running can also be a tool to raise consciousness on other social areas. So when I do run, if I do, I try to write a statement around a cause that I think people must pay attention to. So at least those that follow my pages would know that maybe I'm raising consciousness on gender-based violence, which I've done over the past 2 or so years. Previously I did something on cancer of the colon. But I think I'm starting there because I think there's something I wanted to talk to you about, which is that for the most part that I've known of you, would I be right to characterize you as a runner for social justice issues?
Well, I haven't really used that platform in the past. I know that I follow your pages, so I have seen the work that you've done there. But no, I figuratively. Look, the thing about the marathon is that it forces you into all sorts of places you wouldn't otherwise go. There's that moment, and if you've done a marathon or an ultra marathon, there's that moment when you hit the wall. It's no amount of training prepares you for that because you feel like you just can't. You have to quit. You just want to sleep, and you've got another 30, 40 k's to go. But you keep moving forward, right? Even if you're not running, you walk. You don't stop. And what that's taught me over the years is a sense of perseverance. Social justice is not a moment. I think part of the challenge, certainly in South Africa, but in many parts of the globe, I think, is that we've looked for that uhuru moment, that liberatory moment, as if that's going to miraculously transform things. Unfortunately, freedom doesn't work like that. Liberation doesn't work like that. It's a long journey, and in '94 in South Africa, when we reached that point, it was an important moment, make no mistake. But if you look at where we are now, you know, I think that philosophy that says it's a long journey that we've got to take I think rings all the more true,
Yeah.
because I think
Yeah.
we are as far away from true freedom now
Yeah.
as we ever have been, I think, in the last 28 years.
So there are lessons that can be drawn from running if we are to apply them to our quest to achieve a socially just world, a socially just country for that matter. And you have been in the thick of things as far as different struggles are concerned in the realm of social justice.
Yeah.
Right now, I introduced you as the founding director of Ubumbano. And my understanding of Ubumbano is really an initiative that is established to use solidarity mechanisms as a way of galvanizing actors, communities together to solve different challenges. Can we probably start there and talk about what Ubumbano is, what it seeks to achieve, how it came about?
Yeah. So let me use the analogy of running one last time. The marathon strips you of any artifice, any self-delusion. It strips you of any pride, because when you're broken and you're searching for something to make you carry on, you have to dig deep into yourself and locate yourself in that process. And through that digging deep and exploration of what you really are, what you're made of, that's what gives you eventually the strength to resume the journey and resume the struggle. And now that you've started on the analogy of running, it makes perfect. It's the first time I'm thinking about it like this, actually. But Ubumbano is very much born out of a desire to interrogate our own practice. And to be honest about not just our great successes and our great strengths and the things that make us look very good and that affirm us and make our egos grow a little bit. But it's actually a space where we want to unpack things that don't work and our failures, the areas where we haven't been truly liberatory or emancipatory in our practice. It's an interesting space now, but it wasn't always the case. In the beginning, when I got on board this process of exploration that involved Protestant funding agencies from the global north, actually Protestant development agencies, they would regard themselves as social justice organizations as well, and their partners in Southern Africa. It was in the context of shifting financial flows, reduced funding for South Africa in particular as a middle-income country, the shift to the right in many parts of Europe, reduced funding availability for development. And the local partners said, well, why are you defining our relationship as one that is centered on the transaction of the funding, or the transactional model that the funding relationship has? Did we not fight the struggle against apartheid and colonialism together, regardless of whether there was funding available?
Yeah.
So why are you reducing everything to a financial relationship? Why don't we try and explore a different form of relationship that goes back to those roots of solidarity that allowed us to defeat apartheid and to end colonialism in other parts of Southern Africa? And so that began a journey, and we took an approach that said, we'll make the path by walking it. So we won't predetermine the outcome. We won't say, well, by end of year 5, we want to have a new organization that looks like this and like that and does this and does that. Rather, we will go on this journey together, and what emerges from a process of engagement will be what we will do together. And that's how Ubumbano came into being. It's a space where we interrogate our social justice practice. We say, what does it mean for us as NGOs, funding organizations, faith-based institutions, activists? What does it mean to be in genuine solidarity with those whose lives are being impacted by injustice? Not how well are we applying SDG 17, I don't even know the numbers. But how are we allowing ourselves to be informed by the lived experience of those we ostensibly serve? And that's what Ubumbano, that's how we came into being.
Yeah.
The organization itself is only registered for about 3 or 4 years, so we're still quite young.
Yeah. So it is a critique in many ways of the ways in which philanthropy, as we know, or aid in general, has been practiced. And today there's just so many buzzwords around decolonizing, philanthropy, shifting with power, and all of that. But your approach is from that of solidarity and understanding the context. What are your views on this current buzz around, the debates around decolonizing philanthropy, shifting power? I think sometime later today I might be talking to Jenny, who is a pioneer person behind shifting the power movement.
Yes.
But I'm sure that as Ubumbano, maybe we should have started by just decoding that name, Ubumbano,
Yes.
so that we can then talk about the critique.
Yes. Okay, let me decode the name first. The ACT part is a play on the word action, of course, but it's also because we are members of the Global ACT Alliance, which is a network of a coalition of faith-based institutions globally, and our origins are very much in that association, so we're full members. But the word Ubumbano is a Zulu Nguni word for solidarity, so very much rooted in the region, rooted in Southern Africa, but belonging to the globe, if you will. So solidarity is not funders giving money to struggling communities in poor areas. It's a relational thing that works both ways. And so Ubumbano is in its DNA both European and African, and in fact open to engagement with any parts of the globe where there are communities that are struggling. So that's where the name comes from. The question about these conversations about decoloniality and shifting power, ceding power, I'm not very good at hashtags. I'm not very good at buzzwords. I generally don't like jargon, and I think it's the danger of jargon is that it sometimes lessens our ability to be sharp in our analysis. Because anytime we feel uncertain about what we need to be doing or talking about or saying, we revert to a word that we know is going to, we make assumptions about its meaning, and it allows us to be more comfortable. It's almost like you can breathe, because I recognize that word, and so now I'm in the right place. But when you listen, when you open yourself to listening to the voice of those who resist their oppression, it's not comfortable. Because the language they use, people who are fighting for their very survival, the language they use is often not very palatable. It's not very comforting. It's sometimes it can be violent. It's very disruptive. If we listen with integrity and honesty, it actually makes us uncomfortable. And my worry is that when we try and translate that into our own language as practitioners and as NGO leaders and as opinion makers and all those sorts of things, there's a danger of sanitizing that and putting it into nice sounding phrases. And it loses the impetus because we sound very well-meaning, well-intentioned, but then we shape the conversation so much that it becomes us having the conversation, and we're not really listening with great meaning to those who are impacted on a daily basis, who are struggling and resisting. In short, I enjoy engaging in those discussions. I have a critique that perhaps it's becoming a self-sustaining part of our industry. So you're going to a lot more conferences these days, there's a lot more webinars, everybody's writing something about, and I don't want to say bad things about anybody's hashtag, but there's so many that I think we're losing the essence of, if you want to talk about ceding power, then why don't you talk to the people who are generally deprived of that power by our being, by the work that we do, and actually listen with greater meaning.
The reason I was asking is because, earlier on, before we came on second, even here, you spoke about the philosophy of Ubumbano, that you are paving the way or the path as you go. And it seems to me that if we use the lens of Ubumbano, then coming into this debate would really force us to take our time to listen to those voices and not have pre-assumptions about where these shifts ought to be happening and how they ought to happen, but be informed by the different moments and contexts. So shifting power might actually mean one thing for somebody based in Europe looking into Global South, but it might mean something completely different from somebody in the Global South. And even then, within the Global South, there are different identities, different experiences. So somebody based here in Johannesburg might have a different interpretation to somebody based in the mines, for example. So I just wanted us to use the frame of Ubumbano and this philosophy to begin making sense of these buzzwords and these hashtags.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, we're not denying that there are power dynamics at all times. Everybody has power. Yeah. Even the most marginalized people have power. Yeah. But too often we give authority to traditional forms of power. So male power, financial power, academic power. But the power that comes from occupying maybe a privileged position in society.
Yeah.
I love exploring the power that comes from people's resilience, the power that comes from people successfully navigating a global system that is seeking to destroy them, whether it be capitalism or patriarchy or the onslaught on women with gender-based violence, the onslaught on LGBTI community, and the fact that every day they wake up and they resist and they fight, for me is a massive source of power and inspiration. But our systems often marginalize that or sideline that. It's not front and center. We've intellectualized a lot of the issues, whereas I think if we listen a little bit more carefully, I think we'll find a greater insight into how change happens. If we listen and accompany the people who are actually doing the resisting themselves. But I think that everybody's got a particular... The one last thing I want to say about that is, in the philanthropic development space, money is the big power dynamic, right?
Yeah.
And the big foundations and the big donors, there hasn't been a lot of movement. That tool, that power tool, is still used to advance a particular agenda, even if it's not saying this is what we want you to, these are the kind of political points we want you to take up. But by virtue of the fact that we have to comply very often with conditions of funding, it takes you away from the political dynamics and the political conversations that you want to have. And for me, that's one of the big things we also try to shift.
And clearly, one of the things that maybe we have not said quite, maybe in very clear terms, is that while money on the side of the donor could be a power and a tool, when money gets to grantees or recipients, it can also be a disempowerment tool. Those grantees that have most of the resources at times are the weakest in the system, because money has tendencies of silencing the political views that you might want to engage in.
So we provide small grants for time-bound specific action. We also use grant mechanisms to work with different non-profit organizations. If it's the money that defines the relationship and the conversation, then you're dead in the water. But if you're starting from a political perspective, if you're starting from a lived reality perspective, and you have a discussion about the kind of money that's going to come in that says the money will enable rather than the money will enable action and will enable will enable those aspects of your work that would lead to maybe deeper impact or whatever the case might be, rather than without this money you are nothing. Then I think you can get around that. You can get around that.
So at Ubumbano, I mean, probably 3 or so years old now. Usually, in initiatives of this nature, where you have collaborations between institutions in the global south and the global north, you have to spend a bit of time investing in finding each other. You have to invest a lot of time in conflict management in case there are any conflicts that arise. You have to invest in time in managing diversity, but also making sure that you stick to the end goal. What has been the experience so far for you for the last 3 or so years in partnership building, in staying true to the political cause, but also generally the dynamics in partnerships?
Sure. That's a very interesting, a very big question, Peggy. When I was appointed out, my first employer was the European partners, and they called me a change manager. And I walked into the room, I went around the country and spoke to the different Southern African stakeholders, and I found that they weren't on board this process. The Europeans thought they were. The Southern Africans thought the Europeans must just leave whatever money they have and go back to Europe. And so we had to rebuild the trust. And I think when you open a space for a conversation that is not constrained by any particular agenda, or when you open a space and you put your agendas on the table and you say, don't be shy. If you want to get something out of this process, say it. But don't pretend that you don't have an agenda. Let's put everything on the table and let's interrogate why you have that agenda. What is informing it? Is it genuinely driven by a commitment to social justice or solidarity? Or is it the need to make yourself relevant in the development aid paradigm? Once you do that, and you've got to be honest, right? You've got to be frank about your own positionality. In the first Solidarity Hub, and this is the core of our work, we convene Solidarity Hubs. The first one we had was in 2017. And one of the NGOs said to me, your process says that we must talk about our failings as social justice actors. And yet here's all the heads of all these international donors in the room. Why don't you want us to talk about our successes? You said, geez, you talk about the successes all the time when you submit a funding proposal. You say how great you are, otherwise the funders won't give you the money. How about we foreground a conversation about social justice and liberation and freedom and emancipation and empowerment and dignity, and then say how great or how bad we are. Because when you do that, when you focus the issue and not your own self there, it allows you to have a deeper insight into why we're not achieving the change that we do. People struggle with it. We're so used to needing to show how good we are as NGOs and as activists that we start believing our own propaganda. And we stop questioning whether we're doing the right things, whether we're doing things that are genuinely emancipatory, or whether it's just to make sure that we continue to be relevant. So we've had to grapple with those things. We've appealed to participants in this process to maintain an openness and an honesty and a critical approach. And it's worked. And it hasn't always been smooth sailing. There's times when we've had to have sidebars and have conversations with people and say, you know what, let's see how we can resolve this conflict. But by and large, our processes are such that you can speak truth, you can be vulnerable without fear of being condemned and criticized.
So in many ways, you have to keep working on it. Because
there's no moment,
every moment is a moment of just working on it and making sure that we're sticking to the political cause. But for people to stay focused, there have to be some strategic, passionate goals or even issues that bring them together. And in your case, what are the key strategic programs that you would say this really helps us to keep people focused, but it also helps us to achieve the ultimate goal that you have sought as Ubumbano?
So if you look at our website and our PR documents, you'll see that we're concerned about economic, gender, and environmental justice.
Yeah.
It pretty much covers every form of injustice there is in the world. And so yes, you can say that we've got thematic focus areas. But when we say that we listen to the lived, we are guided by the lived experience of those who resist their oppression and their dehumanization. It means that you've got to suspend your own desire to have 10 programs that deal with climate change and 20 that deal with GBV and 5 that deal with, because that's your traditional model, right? I've got program areas I need to show to my back donors and my stakeholders that I am doing X amount of work in X amount of areas. But if you say, well, I'm supporting 120 different projects that are driven by communities themselves, our calls for proposals always say, are you doing anything to advance the struggle for dignity in your area?
Yeah.
Here's some money to help you do it. Small amounts.
Yeah.
Whether it's a gender justice issue or a climate issue or economic issue, that is determined by the people.
Yeah.
When we bring those people into a space, the Solidarity Hub, we'll invite Bheki from CAPSI to maybe deepen an analysis that we've started doing. But you'll find that most of our convenings, it's people talking about their struggles.
Yeah.
And at the end of each of those convenings, the abiding feedback we get, the overwhelming feedback, it's so nice to be in a space where we're talking about our own struggles.
Yeah.
And not listening to people telling us about how we should be doing things. That's what actually brings people back time and time again, is they find a space where they can actually talk about their struggles and not be spoken at. And some of the feedback through our outcomes harvesting exercises has shown that it's deepened their ability to do the work that they do.
Yeah.
It's energized them. It's opened them up to new experiences and new ways of doing things. That's really what keeps us together.
Yeah. So the Solidarity Hub, can we talk a bit about its configuration? What happens in there? What are the principles that you adopt? How many of them do you have? I mean, in one of the conversations, I think you mentioned that you are planning to establish one in Europe.
Yes.
Can we talk about that?
Yes, so at least one big one every year.
Yeah.
And the last one we had, I think everybody was so fed up with online stuff that there was overwhelming interest. I mean, everybody came.
Yeah.
We had it budgeted for 70 people and there were about 90 plus from throughout Southern Africa and further afield. So we try and have at least one big Solidarity Hub over 3 days, but we also have what we call learning hubs, which are smaller and 20 to 25 people from the region. We're hoping to then also have localized ones in country. So we've been working with facilitators to develop the methodology. And so the hubs are really spaces for interrogating our practice. That's really what it is. And you'll find it's very different to your traditional conferences in the sense that the learning and the knowledge is generated through sharing of experiences and conversations about that. The action orientation emerges not out of the desire to have a conference declaration, but out of a connection of people who are doing similar work. So a case in point would be a group in Zimbabwe who have become, they met a group from Malawi, and they both work on menstrual health issues and sexual rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and work with young girls, young women. They're connected and are collaborating on ways that we would never have predicted, because they found each other in the sharing of their own experiences. So those are the Solidarity Hubs. It's a space where we must interrogate our own practice. Part of the challenge is, remember I mentioned we are both European and African in our DNA. I don't know the extent to which our European partners have done the same. So we were hoping that we would we would convene something like that this year. A similar process where it's about interrogating practice and not listening to experts tell us about practice.
Great. So, I mean, I know we might not have enough time to really grasp everything.
I'll come back.
But we are fascinated by this. But something keeps banging at the back of my mind, which is that when I look at you and your experiences and your history, you have always been in spaces where you are seeking to address issues of social injustice. So you were in the churches, you were at the Southern Africa Trust and many other institutions, and you and I actually have known each other from way back. Would you take a bit of some time and just pick some moments in your upbringing all the way to today that you would say, these are the things that actually have shaped your approaches, but also you are drawing on as you are leading this process now?
Wow. In the 80s I was throwing stones just here down the road at Wits main campus. Well, no, I wasn't throwing the stones, actually. Other people were throwing stones behind me. I was well behaved. I was a good young Christian student.
That says you were throwing stones.
I can tell you who the ones were that were throwing stones. No, I think there's two experiences that I would talk about, Betty. From a professional point of view, during my student time, I was involved and I worked full-time for an organization called the Young Christian Students. And it was very much at the forefront of young people's struggles against apartheid. It's a global Catholic movement in South Africa. It was interdenominational. And it had at its core a process called the Review of Life. And it used a method called the See, Judge, Act method. And the Review of Life meant that when you did political analysis, you had to locate yourself within it. So it's all very well talking intellectually about the evils of apartheid, the evils of capitalism, and how the struggle needs to evolve, and how formations need to do X, Y, and Z. But if you're not challenging your own complicity or your own role in those things, then you're actually externalizing an analysis that doesn't allow you to advance and enhance your own agency in there. So that life experience at the Young Christian Students at YCS was a very fundamental shaper of my own practice. If I go back a little bit further, my parents were very much... my father was a medical doctor in a small town called Vryheid. And the story goes that while he was still a student, he was passing through and fell ill and couldn't find a doctor that would see him. It's a very conservative Afrikaner town. And so when he completed his studies, he went back to live there and served the local black community for close on 30 years as the only black doctor in town. And I think that concept of service is something that has, throughout my family, I think you'll find that spirit of service to humanity is a core part of our DNA. Might explain why none of us turned out to be very successful business people, but it does explain why many of us have done our bit. So that would be a big part of how I ended up in this kind of work. It's a privilege, I must add. There's very few places where you can get paid a salary to do the kind of work that I do. So I'm eternally grateful for that, and I'm mindful of the privilege that comes with it.
And you, I, and several others were very much involved in the early beginnings of a movement around, organizing philanthropy in the continent, whether it's through the formation of the African Grantmakers Networks and many others. And at that time, you were part of the Southern Africa Trust team that was also very much influential in the southern part of the continent, on working on alleviating and trying to address issues to do with poverty. If I were to say, today, where you are sitting, if we are to look at philanthropy and its role, what would be the key functions that we ought to be asking philanthropy as a discipline to be addressing?
Yeah. I think the concept of voice and agency of those who are most affected by issues remains, for me, one of the biggest challenges of the philanthropic space. You know, private philanthropy, foundations, you know, the money belongs to the wealthy person that, you know, bequeaths that money to the foundation. So, I mean, I haven't quite figured out how do you challenge the person whose money it is to actually genuinely see that money and say, let it do what it must in support of local struggles. And let it not be encumbered and limited and constrained by my own personal preferences. That for me is the biggest one, right? Especially where you've got living benefactors, or I don't know what the right wording terminology is. So that would be one of the things. When we have the conversations about shifting the power, about decolonized practice, it actually involves, I think Halima Muhammad talks about building power rather than seeding power. Yeah, I mean, I haven't explored it in its full implications. But I think philanthropy has got a lot of contradictions it has to work through. How it genuinely listens to the lived experience of those who defend their dignity. For me, that's key. Because if it does that, then a lot of the practices that maintain the status quo, that continue to manifest traditional relationships of power, unless we listen carefully to the lived experience of those at the margins, we will continue to be complicit in maintaining a system. For me, that's one of the biggest challenges of philanthropy.
And then, of course, back to Ubumbano, what would success look like for you as the founding director, the person steering this ship, of course, with the support of your board, your members? But what would success look like? I know your philosophy is we are paving the path as we go.
Yes.
But at some point you want to reach somewhere, we don't know. But what would it look like?
Yeah. I think if we can maintain a commitment to a critical reflection process that genuinely centers marginalized voice and agency, for me that would be success. If we're able to challenge social justice practitioners, activists, faith institutions to take a more self-critical approach to understanding power relations, that would be success. So we work with faith institutions and we challenge faith leaders often to understand their positionality, their own power as leaders of churches and other faith institutions, and how that impacts on their ability to listen to the lived experience of people. It's particularly topical now with what's happening in Uganda with the assault on the LGBTI community. Faith institutions play a big part in that. We found that through going through a process of critical self-reflection allows people who would otherwise be constrained by conservative theological and ideological positions, when they locate themselves within analyzing what it means to be loving and finding God's dignity, the dignity of God's creation. When you take people through a process of self-discernment like that, it's amazing how powerful it is in shifting these hateful notions of exclusion and continued marginalization of certain sectors of society. If we can carry on doing that, Bhekinkosi, I don't care whether we've got 10 million or 100 million rand in reserves, or whether we're funding programs, if we can continue to center the experience of marginalized communities, that would be for me success. I'm often challenged by people that we collaborate with, but also by back donors who will say, you need to start going to more international platforms to speak about gender, environmental, or whatever, justice or whatever issues. You need to be more visible. You need to reach more countries. And there's always the temptation to build an empire. It's what NGOs do, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're doing really nice work and good work.
Yeah.
But we deliberately are not necessarily going to try to be big.
Yeah.
We do want to be relevant. We do want to be true to our practice, which is an emancipatory practice, rather than a practice that maintains a status quo that doesn't lead to transformation.
And I'll tell you that for me, I've been fascinated by your journey as an institution. And one of the things that I really applaud you and the team is that you have also allowed yourselves to study your journey. And I'm happy that one of your staff members is actually looking critically at the journey of Ubumbano. And hopefully, the findings are going to be also useful for yourselves and your partners going forward. And so from our end, really, we appreciate the work that you are doing. I want to end on maybe a personal note as well. There was a time between the Southern African Trust and I think your next endeavor where you actually moved to Swaziland.
Yes.
Can we talk about that move?
Yeah, that was quite an experience.
Yeah, can we talk about that move? I've always been fascinated. I've always wanted to ask you. And as we were speaking now, I just remembered. By the way, Ashley just moved to Swaziland for quite some time.
You're touching on all the things that are very important in my life. There's a school there, which called Waterford Kamsham.
Right.
And it was set up 60 years ago in opposition as an alternative to apartheid education. And my brother-in-law was the deputy principal there. We used to visit, and I fell in love with the place. At any given time, there's over 50 nationalities in the school.
Yeah.
It's based on a philosophy of diversity and of educating for peace. And so I wanted my boys to go there.
Yeah.
So I quit my job at the Southern Africa Trust. The director at the time he wasn't happy.
Yeah.
But I went into freelance consulting. But for 10 years I lived in Swaziland. And for most of that time, until 2016 when I took on this gig that I'm doing now, but I freelanced, and we had a chance to get our boys to complete their education, 7 years of education at Waterford each. I wouldn't change that for the world. We've got to have different conversations and experiences for our kids.
Yeah.
And I think Waterford offered that opportunity for them. And I think by their own admission, even though they missed the friends they left when we crossed the border, they would be the first to say it's the best thing that they did. I continue to serve on the governing council of the school. I've got a couple more years left and then I've got to step down. Because I believe that it's one of the African institutions, like the Africa Philanthropy Network, like CAPSI, like other institutions that are African in nature, but that are global in outlook, and there's absolutely no false modesty about their ability to impact on the world. And Waterford is one of those schools that I think is an important institution to me. I'm back in Joburg. It's a mixed bag. I'm back in my home in Johannesburg. I'm loving being back. I get to come and talk to you like this, which is nice. But I certainly had a great 10 years in Swaziland. What's happening now, I think, the people who are resisting the assault on their dignity in Swaziland need all the support they can get. And it doesn't necessarily mean money. It means solidarity. Much like in South Africa, the solidarity, the anti-apartheid movement lent solidarity to us. So I think it's time for us to do the same.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about how the boys are doing, but you have already responded through that question. And I think we might as well use this opportunity to, render our deepest condolences, but also, honor the services of Tulani Maseko.
Absolutely.
The human rights lawyer who was assassinated in Swaziland recently. I think all of us who work in this space were really devastated because we knew Tulani and everyone knows the work that Tulani does. And that might also have come as a big shock to you in the system because you have lived in that country for 10 years.
Yeah, Swaziland is a strange place. When I got there were protests happening, and that was in 2012. There were some quite strident protests, and I thought that, the regime would change and there would be reform.
Yeah.
It's amazing how resilient the system is.
Yeah.
But you can never overestimate the patience of the people. And so towards the end, I was there when the riots happened. In fact, factories were being burnt not a kilometer from where I lived.
Yeah.
And every morning I was driving close to the border in order to connect. There was no internet. So some interesting stories about that experience. But I think that the world was taken, well, those who watch Swaziland is such a small place that it's often forgotten in the global situation. Those who saw what was happening couldn't believe the level of anger and frustration people had.
Yeah.
And so it can go down that route of, never-ending conflict if it's not managed properly. The regional governments have to change.
Yeah.
But you see, that's where power is. Whether they're going to actually listen is another story. So it's up to people, ordinary people like us, to continue to support the people of Swaziland.
Great. And of course, we are wrapping up. I think we are one of the few groups that have really taken on this idea of harnessing the power of technology. And the last time I checked, you did not have a physical office. Am I right?
We still don't have a physical office. We work remotely.
Yeah.
It means that every once a month I get to have a really nice lunch with my team.
Yeah.
The board said I have to do that. It includes a bottle of wine. But it's been effective. We're a small team, so it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But we use, we connect on a daily basis using technology. But we also are trying to harness technology in how we are reaching out to and supporting the struggles of local communities. So I must tell you, there's a bit of a plug.
Yeah.
This is not a news item, but next week we'll be doing a soft launch. We've supported the development of an app. So one of the activists works with expunging criminal records. In South Africa, a major obstacle to people getting jobs is a criminal record that they don't even know they had. And they only find it out when people are doing the checking.
Yeah.
And it's a far bigger problem than I knew. And so we've supported the development of an app which we're launching now. It's not our app. It belongs to Freedoms SA. That's the organization. And it's to spread the information and the knowledge of how to go about expunging your criminal record. I'm hoping it's a very good thing. I think it will be.
Yeah.
But you see, it's us supporting the amplification and agency of local initiatives, not our own. We're doing the same with telling the story of a small NGO called Lulibo that have been engaging with traditional healers and leaders around issues of sexuality and SRHR, and using cartoons. And we'll maybe have an online comic strip. So we're open to exploring different ways of doing these things, like podcasts. We haven't yet experimented with those, but we certainly will try and do those.
Yeah. I have a lot of other areas that I would want us to cover, but maybe as we monitor the growth of Ubumbano, we'll invite you back as well so that we can talk more around your experiences post 3-4 year period. So I'm really glad that you made the time. Thank you so much for making the time, Ashley. I wanted us to have this conversation and I've learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers will also be pulling out some of the key messages out of this conversation. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you, Peggy, for the opportunity. Can I say that CAPSI is, the conversation around it started when I was still at the Trust.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to see that it's become this significant institution on the landscape in Africa. So congratulations to you. And I look at your newsletter every month.
Yeah.
It's a plug for my newsletter. It's a very useful short newsletter. Sign up, go to the website, and you'll get all sorts of interesting stories.
I actually received your newsletter, and I think I told you that I really like the way it's done.
Thank you.
The team is here that does our newsletter. There's Letu, there's Tembi, there's Tandy out there. So, we are trying our best also to just make ourselves visible. Yeah. That was Ashley Green Thompson joining us. He's the founding director of Ubumbano. Ubumbano. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.